The year was 1878, and the silence of the high plains was a living thing. It pressed in on the small, lonely cabin Elias Blackwood had built with his own hands, a constant pressure against the thin walls of hewn pine. For Elias, the silence was both a punishment and a refuge. It held the echo of a voice he would never hear again, the ghost of a laugh that had once filled the small space with a light that now seemed impossible. Grief had weight. It settled in the corners of the room like dust. It clung to the wool of his blankets, and it sat heavy in his chest with every breath he drew. He had come here with Clara, his wife, drawn by the promise of a life carved from the vast, unblemished canvas of the West. They had seen not emptiness, but possibility. Now, alone, Elias saw only the emptiness. Clara had been gone for 2 winters, taken by a fever that burned through her with the ruthless speed of a prairie fire. He was left with the land, the silence, and their daughter, Clara. Clara was 6 years old, a small, bright flame in the grey landscape of her father's sorrow. She had her mother's eyes, the color of a summer sky just before dusk, and a spirit that the crushing quiet of their existence had not yet managed to dim. Elias loved her with a fierce, protective ache that was almost painful. He fed her, kept her warm, and taught her the hard lessons of survival on the frontier. He built walls around their small plot of land, and higher walls around his heart, believing that to protect her from the world, he had to shield her from the depths of his own loss. His conversations with her were clipped and practical, instructions and warnings. Stay close to the cabin, Clara. Don't wander to the creek alone. Mind the fire. He gave her sustenance, but he had forgotten how to give her comfort. Their life was a rhythm of necessity. Before dawn, Elias would rise, the cold floorboards groaning under his weight. He would stir the embers in the stone hearth, chop wood until his arms burned with a satisfying fire of their own, and mend what was broken a fence post, a leather harness, a worn-out boot sole. He worked to keep the encroaching wilderness at bay, and to keep the encroaching memories from consuming him entirely. He moved through his days with a grim determination, a man hollowed out by sorrow, functioning on the fumes of duty alone. The future was not a sunrise he looked toward, but simply the next task on a list that never ended. This small, isolated world was all they had, a fortress of grief standing against the immense, indifferent expanse of the sky and land. One afternoon, the sun beat down with a late summer intensity, bleaching the color from the tall grasses. Elias was splitting logs behind the cabin, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a familiar percussion to his thoughts. Clara was meant to be on the porch, arranging a small family of pebbles into neat rows. The rule was clear. She was never to leave the shadow of the cabin without him. But the world was wide and full of wonders for a 6-year-old, and the shimmering ribbon of the creek, though forbidden, sang a siren's song. A sharp cry, thin and high, cut through the air. It wasn't the sound of play, it was the sound of alarm. Elias dropped the axe. His heart seized, a cold fist of fear clenching inside his chest. He grabbed the rifle that was always leaning against the cabin wall and moved, his long strides eating up the distance to the front of the house. Clara was not on the porch. He saw her small figure down by the creek bed, a splash of faded blue calico against the tan earth. She was not alone. Kneeling beside her was another child, a native child, small and still, clad in worn buckskin. The child's black hair was matted with dust and burrs, and their skin was stretched taut over delicate bones. Elias's blood ran cold. His mind, conditioned by tales from passing freighters and the nervous gossip in the distant settlement, leaped to the darkest conclusions. A scout, a lure. He raised the rifle, the stock smooth and familiar against his shoulder, his eye aligning with the sight. Clara. His voice was a raw tear in the fabric of the afternoon. Get away from her, now. Clara looked up, her face a mask of distress, not for herself, but for the stranger. Papa, she's hurt, she's scared. I said now. He advanced cautiously, his boots crunching on the dry ground, the rifle held steady. The native child did not move, only watched him with wide, dark eyes that held no fight, only a profound and weary terror. It was a girl. She couldn't be much older than Clara. Her lips were cracked and pale, and she trembled, not from cold, but from exhaustion and fear. The immediate threat Elias had imagined, war party hidden in the tall grass, began to feel absurd in the face of this small, pathetic reality. This was not a warrior. This was a lost child, half dead from thirst. Clara stood her ground, placing her small body partially in front of the girl, a gesture of instinctive, irrational protection. "She needs water, Papa. Please." Elias's finger hesitated on the trigger. He looked from his daughter's pleading face to the fragile creature huddled on the ground. The hardened shell of his fear and prejudice cracked just a little. He lowered the rifle, the tension in his shoulders easing by a fraction. The world was still a dangerous place. His instincts still screamed caution, but the immediate command of his daughter's compassion was a force he could not deny. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "Bring her to the porch, and stay where I can see you." He did not offer to help, his mistrust still a palpable barrier between them. He watched, his hand never straying far from his weapon, as his daughter coaxed the strange, silent girl to her feet and slowly, haltingly, led her back toward the cabin. The fortress had been breached. Inside the cabin, the air grew thick with a tension that was different from the usual quiet sorrow. It was the tension of a held breath, of a coiled snake. Elias stood by the door, the rifle now resting in the crook of his arm, watching every movement. The native girl, whose name they did not know, sat on the floor just inside the threshold, as if she understood she was an unwelcome guest and dared not venture further. She was a piece of the wilderness brought inside, a tangible reminder of the world beyond his fences that he so desperately wanted to keep out. Clara, oblivious to her father's simmering anxiety, moved with a simple, direct purpose. She fetched a tin cup of water from the bucket, her small hands careful not to spill a drop. She knelt before the girl and offered it. The girl's dark eyes darted from the cup to Elias, then back to Clara. Hesitantly, she reached out with a trembling hand and took it, drinking in small, desperate gulps that spoke of a thirst that went bone deep. When the cup was empty, she handed it back with a silent nod, a flicker of gratitude in her exhausted gaze. "She's hungry, Papa," Clara whispered, looking up at him. Elias gave a curt nod, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He gestured toward the sack of cornmeal. "Make some mush, not too much." The act of providing felt like a concession, a dangerous crack in his defenses. Every instinct screamed at him to take the child back to where she was found, to leave her to her fate, to the people who would surely come looking for her. The thought of them warriors, fathers, brothers sent a fresh wave of unease through him. He was one man, with one rifle and one child to protect. Harboring this girl was an invitation to a conflict he could not win. As dusk began to bruise the sky into shades of purple and orange, the weather turned. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin like a thing grieving. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the distant mountains, a promise of a storm that would soon break. Sending the girl out into that was impossible, a cruelty that even his fear-hardened heart could not stomach. She would stay the night. The decision settled in his gut like a cold stone. He barred the door and added another log to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel even more confined. The girl sat huddled in a blanket Clara had given her, her eyes following Elias's every move. She had not spoken a word. Her name was a mystery, her story a void. She was simply a presence, a catalyst that had shattered the fragile peace of their solitude. Clara sat near her, sharing the warmth of the hearth. She chattered away, pointing to her dolls, to the pictures in a tattered book, filling the silence with her innocent voice, as if this were a perfectly normal evening. The native girl just watched, her expression unreadable. Elias watched them both, a silent guardian trapped between his duty to his daughter's kindness and his terror of the consequences. The storm broke with a sudden, violent crack of lightning, and the rain came down in sheets, erasing the world outside. Inside the cabin, the three of them were a small, unlikely island in a sea of darkness and noise. Later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the storm had quieted to a steady drumming on the roof, Clara fell asleep on her cot. Elias remained awake, his rifle across his lap, his gaze fixed on the small form wrapped in the blanket near the hearth. The girl's breathing was shallow, but even in the flickering firelight, she looked impossibly young, her face softened by sleep, stripped of the fear and exhaustion that had marked her earlier. He saw not a Cheyenne, not an enemy, but simply a child, a lost child, far from her own home, her own father. The thought struck him with an unexpected force. Somewhere out in that rain-soaked darkness, a father was searching, his heart gripped by the same cold fear that had seized Elias that afternoon. The shared, universal terror of a parent for a lost child momentarily transcended the divide of language, culture, and conflict. It was a bridge of pure, raw emotion. For the first time, Elias felt a flicker of empathy, a feeling he had thought long buried with his wife. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the world scrubbed clean by the storm. The air was fresh with the scent of wet earth and pine. The native girl was awake, watching the fire as Clara stirred and sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The immediate tension of the previous night had lessened, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. What now? The storm was over. The girl was stronger. She could not stay. As Elias prepared a simple breakfast of bacon and coffee, he watched the two children. Clara, with the unthinking generosity of the very young, was trying to communicate. She pointed to herself, Clara. Then she pointed to the girl, her expression a question. The girl hesitated, then touched her own chest and spoke a single soft word. Vivina. Vivina, Clara repeated, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. A smile broke across her face. A name made the stranger reel. Vivina seemed to understand the shift. A little of the fear receded from her eyes. She watched Clara move about the cabin, her gaze falling upon a small wooden box on the mantelpiece, the box where Elias kept Sarah's things. Clara saw her looking. Without a thought, she went to the mantel, carefully took the box down, and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a silver locket. It was simple, oval-shaped, and worn smooth with time. It had been Sarah's most prized possession, a gift from her own mother. After Sarah's death, Elias couldn't bear to look at it, but he couldn't bring himself to put it away completely. He had given it to Clara, a tangible piece of the mother she barely remembered. Elias started to speak, to tell her to put it back, but the words died in his throat. He watched, frozen, as his daughter lifted the locket from its box. The silver chain pooled in her small palm. She turned to Vivina, whose eyes were wide with a kind of quiet awe. Vivina was shivering slightly, more from nerves than cold now. She looked small and alone, a solitary figure against the backdrop of their lives. Clara saw it too. She saw a girl who had nothing, who was lost and frightened. And in that moment, she did something that would alter the course of all their lives. She took the locket, her one true treasure, and stepped toward Vivina. She lifted the chain and, with gentle, solemn fingers, fastened it around the native girl's neck. The silver oval rested against Vivina's buckskin dress, a startling, luminous gleam of civilization against the wild. Vivina's hand rose to touch it, her fingers tracing its smooth surface as if it were a talisman of impossible power. Her dark eyes lifted to meet Clara's, and in them was a depth of understanding that needed no words. Elias felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. He saw not just his daughter's impulsive gift, but the echo of his wife's spirit. Sarah had been like Saturn open, giving soul who saw the humanity in everyone. The locket was more than silver. It was a vessel of memory, of love, of a life that had been extinguished. And his daughter had just given it away to a stranger, an act of pure, unblemished kindness that sliced through the layers of his grief and bitterness like a clean, sharp blade. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart began to crumble. He felt a profound, aching love for his daughter, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. In her, Sarah was not gone. She was alive. It was mid-morning when they appeared. Elias saw them first, a line of riders cresting the ridge to the east, their forms silhouetted against the bright sky. They were not a frantic search party, but a disciplined, deliberate procession. Cheyenne warriors. His blood turned to ice. The moment he had feared was upon him. "Clara, inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Take Vivina, get to the back of the cabin and stay down." The girls scrambled inside without question, their faces pale with shared fear. Elias grabbed his rifle, checked the load, and stood on the porch, his body a rigid line of defiance. He would not let them see his terror. He would die here, on this patch of land, before he let them harm his child. The riders descended the ridge slowly, their ponies picking their way through the tall grass. There were 5 of them, their faces painted, their presence radiating a quiet, lethal authority. The man at their head was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a landscape of hard-won battles and deep-seated sorrows. He wore a single eagle feather in his hair, and his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to burn with a fierce intelligence. He was clearly the leader, a man of great power, a war chief. They halted 100 yards from the cabin, a silent, menacing line. The chief dismounted, handing the reins of his pony to the warrior beside him. He began to walk toward the cabin, his steps measured and purposeful. He carried no weapon in his hands, but his entire being was a weapon. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, profound silence. This was it, the reckoning. He braced himself for the charge, for the war cry, for the end. But just as the chief drew closer, the cabin door creaked open. Vivina, unable to stay hidden, ran out onto the porch. "Papa!" she cried out, her voice a thin, reedy sound in the vast emptiness. The chief stopped dead. His impassive face broke, relief and love flooding his hard features. He opened his arms, and Vivina flew into them, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, rocking her back and forth, his eyes closed as he murmured her name. For a moment, he was not a war chief. He was only a father who had found his lost child. Elias watched, his own parental terror from the day before echoing in the chief's embrace. The scene was so deeply, universally human that it momentarily disarmed him. Then the chief's eyes opened. He looked down at his daughter, his hand stroking her hair. His gaze fell upon the front of her dress. He saw the glint of silver. He saw the locket. A change came over him, so profound it was like seeing a mountain shift. The relief in his face vanished, replaced by an expression of utter, stark disbelief. He slowly reached out a finger and touched the locket, his hand trembling slightly. He lifted it, his eyes tracing its familiar shape, the worn smoothness of its surface. He looked up, his gaze locking with Elias's. It was not a look of aggression, it was a look of piercing, stunned inquiry. The rifle in Elias's hands suddenly felt heavy and useless. The confrontation he had prepared for was not happening. Something else was, something far stranger and more complex. The war chief, Moketavato, recognized the locket. The air between the 2 men was stretched taut, a fragile thread woven from fear, confusion, and a dawning, impossible recognition. Moketavato stood with his daughter clinging to his leg, his hand still hovering over the silver locket that lay against her chest. He did not speak. His eyes, dark and deep as a forest at midnight, were fixed on Elias, searching, questioning, demanding an answer to a question he had not yet asked. Elias lowered the rifle, resting its butt on the wooden porch. The gesture was a risk, an offering of truce in a language he hoped the man would understand. He stood straight, his hands open at his sides. He was a father, not a soldier. He needed this man to see that. Clara, drawn by the silence, appeared in the doorway behind him. She peeked around his leg, her small face a mirror of the tension that held the two men captive. Moketavato's gaze shifted to Clara, then back to the locket. He spoke, his voice low and guttural, a language of stone and wind that Elias could not comprehend. But the tone was not a threat. It was laced with something that sounded like sorrow, like a memory being unearthed. Seeing the stalemate, Clara stepped forward. She pointed a small finger at the locket. Then she pointed to her own chest, patting it gently. "Mama," she said, the word soft but clear. She then looked at Vivina and made a gesture of giving, her small hands pushing outward from her heart. She smiled, a fragile, hopeful thing. "Friend." The simplicity of the act, the purity of the child's explanation, seemed to break the spell. Moketavato looked at Clara, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the sky-blue eyes, the earnest face, the absence of fear. He saw the echo of another woman, from another time. One of the warriors behind him urged his pony forward a few steps. He was younger, and he spoke in halting, heavily accented English. "Chief asks, where you get this?" Elias looked from the warrior to the chief, then to the locket that had once belonged to his wife. How could he explain? The story was a ghost, a fragment of a life lived before him. He only knew pieces of it, whispered to him by Sarah on long winter nights. She had come west years earlier, not as a homesteader, but as a teacher's assistant at a mission far to the south, near the lands the Cheyenne called home. It was a brief posting, a year of her life she rarely spoke of, but one that had marked her. "It was my wife's," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "Her name was Sarah." At the sound of the name, Moketavato flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. He spoke again in his own tongue, his words sharp and urgent. The young warrior translated. He knew a Sarah, a woman with hair the color of corn silk and eyes like the sky. She was a friend to his sister. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture Elias had never imagined. "My wife, she was a teacher," he managed to say. "She taught the children at the mission." Moketavato nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Elias's face. He began to speak again, a longer, more resonant flow of words. The story unfolded through the young warrior's careful translation, a bridge of language built across a chasm of years and grief. The chief's sister, a young woman named Sotayo, or Star Woman, had been curious about the white man's world. She had gone to the mission, not to convert, but to learn, to understand the people who were changing the face of the land. There, she had met Sarah. The two women, from worlds that were on a collision course, had formed a bond of improbable friendship. They had shared stories, taught each other words from their own languages, and found a common ground in their shared humanity. Before Sarah left the mission to return east, she had given her friend a gift, a symbol of their connection, a silver locket. The warrior continued, his voice somber. Sotayo treasured this. It was a sign that peace was possible, that a bridge could be built. His face darkened. 2 seasons later, she was killed, not by soldiers in a battle, by whiskey traders who attacked her camp. They took everything. The locket was believed to have been stolen, a symbol of a broken promise, a friendship ending in violence and loss, an emblem of the white man's treachery. Moketavato had mourned his sister deeply. The locket became a painful memory, a representation of a brief, hopeful moment that had been cruelly extinguished. To see it now, here, on his own daughter given, not in violence, but in an act of childhood kindness that mirrored the original gift, was a shock that resonated through the deepest chambers of his heart. The past had risen up to meet the present in the most unexpected way imaginable. He looked down at Vivina, who had listened to the exchange with wide, uncomprehending eyes. He gently unfastened the locket from her neck. The silver felt warm from her skin. He held it in his palm, a tangible piece of his family's history, a story of friendship and sorrow. He then looked at Elias, and for the first time, Elias saw past the war chief. He saw a man who had loved and lost, just as he had. He saw a father who feared for his child, just as he did. The chasm between them had closed. With a grave solemnity, Moketavato stepped forward and held the locket out to Elias. Elias shook his head. "No," he said, his voice finding a new strength. He looked at Clara, whose small hand had found his. It was given as a gift. It should remain one. He met Moketavato's gaze. A gift, from one friend to another. The war chief held his gaze for a long moment. He saw the truth and sincerity in Elias's eyes. He saw the reflection of his own grief, his own love for his child. He made a choice, not as a war chief weighing a strategic decision, but as a man honoring a sacred memory. He closed his hand around the locket, then turned and fastened it once more around Vivina's neck. He rested his hand on her head, a gesture of blessing and acceptance. The tension did not just break, it dissolved, evaporating into the clear morning air. Moketavato gave a short, sharp command to his men. They relaxed their postures, their menacing stillness replaced by a quiet watchfulness. The war chief turned back to Elias. He placed his hand over his heart and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement of a debt paid, a circle closed. He swept Vivina up into his arms and carried her to his pony, seating her in front of him. Before mounting, he paused and spoke one final word, looking directly at Elias. The young warrior translated, a slight smile touching his lips. He says, "Thank you." Then they were gone. They rode back up the ridge, not as a war party, but as a father taking his daughter home. Elias stood on the porch with Clara, watching until their silhouettes disappeared against the vast, blue canvas of the sky. The cabin was quiet again when they went back inside, but it was a different kind of quiet. The suffocating silence of grief had been replaced by a silence of peace, of wonder. The air felt lighter, the space larger. The fortress had been breached, not by an enemy, but by an act of grace. Elias sank onto the bench by the table, the strength finally leaving his legs. He pulled Clara into his lap, holding her close, burying his face in her hair. He breathed in the scent of her, of wood smoke and childhood. He did not have the words to explain the enormity of what had just happened, the strange and beautiful collision of past and present. He could only hold her. "Is Vivina safe now, Papa?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Yes," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She's safe. She's with her father." He looked around the small room that had been his prison for 2 years. He saw the rough-hewn table where Sarah had served their meals, the cot where she had slept, the empty space beside him that had ached with her absence. The pain was still there, a dull, familiar throb. But for the first time, it was not the only thing he felt. He also felt a surge of overwhelming pride and a nascent, fragile hope. The locket was gone. The last physical piece of Sarah he had held onto was now traveling across the plains, resting against the chest of a Cheyenne girl. But in its absence, Sarah's spirit felt more present than ever. It lived on not in a piece of silver, but in their daughter's heart. It had reached across the divides of culture, of hatred, of time itself, to protect them. Sarah's love, channeled through her daughter, had stopped a war before it could begin. It had turned a feared enemy into a man who understood. That evening, as the sun set and painted the plains in hues of rose and gold, Elias did not bar the door with a sense of dread. He sat with Clara on the porch steps, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. He pointed out the constellations, telling her the names Sarah had taught him. He told her stories of her mother, not just of her death, but of her life, of her laughter, of her boundless kindness. He spoke of her as if she were a living presence, a warm light rather than a cold shadow. He had built this homestead as a bulwark against the world, a place to hide from his pain. But today, the world had come to his door, and it had not brought the destruction he feared. It had brought a lost child, a memory, and a chance for a new beginning. The land no longer seemed merely hostile and indifferent. It was a place of harsh beauty, yes, but also a place of profound and unpredictable connection. A place where a simple act of kindness could rewrite a history of conflict. He hugged Clara tightly, feeling the steady beat of her small heart against his chest. He was still a man marked by loss, living on the edge of a wild and uncertain world, but he was no longer a ghost. He was a father, and for the first time in a very long time, he looked out at the vast, silent land and felt not the weight of what was gone, but the immense, quiet possibility of what was to come. Home was not just a fortress against sorrow, it could also be a beacon of hope.